Why did my husband's lawyer appear at my workplace with documents while my colleagues stared in shock? Was it really so wrong to say my coworker was just being nice when I knew the truth was far deeper? I thought he was overreacting, but he answered with a binder and the court seal. My name is Selene Armitage. I am 31 years old, and I work as an office assistant in a busy insurance agency where most of my day is answering calls and filing forms. I have always told myself that I deserve more than ordinary routines, so I chase little secrets that make me feel alive, even when those secrets create storms I cannot control. I married Daniel because he was steady and patient, but I twist those same traits into weapons by calling him boring or insecure whenever I want sympathy. I believe I can outtalk anyone if I smile enough, so I exaggerate his questions until people think he is controlling, and I frame my own lies as self-defense. I told myself that hiding my connection with Adrian was harmless, because everyone needs something private. But the truth is, I enjoyed the thrill of knowing more than my husband did. I thought silence from Daniel meant surrender, but I learned too late that his quiet nature was not weakness. It was the foundation of his plan to break me with facts I could not deny. It began at my sister Sophie's apartment on a Saturday night, one of those casual family dinners where too many chairs are crammed around the table and people talk over one another about work, children, and neighborhood gossip. I had dressed up more than usual, hoping to remind everyone that I was still the most interesting person in the room because I hated the thought of being invisible. Daniel sat at the far end with Lily in his lap, quietly pouring juice into her cup and listening without interrupting, which only made me itch to throw him into the spotlight. Sophie teased me about how calm Daniel was, saying she could never live with a man who spent so much time in silence, and I jumped on the chance to perform. I laughed loudly and told everyone that marriage would be unbearably boring if there were no secrets, and I added that my husband simply did not understand that little mysteries kept life fun. The table chuckled, Sophie clapped her hands with excitement, and I felt the eyes on me, which was exactly what I wanted. Daniel looked at me with that expression I had seen many times, a quiet kind of disappointment, but he said nothing, and I used his silence as proof that he was embarrassed. I leaned further into it, telling them that he had once questioned me about my coworker Adrian, as if friendliness at the office meant anything more, and I exaggerated by saying Daniel practically checked my phone whenever I set it down. Everyone groaned in sympathy for me, shaking their heads, muttering about insecure men, and I basked in it like a warm spotlight. Sophie told me that men who asked too many questions were just afraid of strong women, and I nodded eagerly, pretending to be the brave victim of Daniel's suspicion. My mother Ruth tried to smooth the tension by saying, "All couples bicker sometimes," but I rolled my eyes and said Daniel took everything too seriously, making her sound old-fashioned. Daniel's mother Margaret stiffened in her chair, asking why I thought it was wise to share private matters at the table. But I smiled sweetly and said I was only joking. That made her seem humorless, which pleased me because I liked pushing her into the role of the uptight critic. Daniel's father Henry stayed quiet, sipping his drink and watching carefully, but I ignored him because silence was easier to twist. Lily tugged on Daniel's sleeve and asked why Daddy looked sad, and I quickly told her he was just tired from work, brushing off the truth. The food arrived, conversation shifted, and I sat back with a triumphant feeling, convinced that once again I had turned him into the dull one while I remained the star. After cake was served, I slipped into the hallway to fix my makeup and stared at my reflection, enjoying the glow of attention. I pulled out my phone and texted Adrian a playful message, saying my husband was lecturing me again about being too close to male co-workers, and I added a laughing emoji to make light of it. Adrian replied almost instantly with a line that made me grin, and I tucked my phone away before returning to the table. Daniel saw the flush in my cheeks and asked later if I had been texting, and I told him he was imagining things, that he always read into nothing, making him feel like the paranoid one. On the ride home, he drove in silence, Lily nodding off in the back seat, while I replayed my own performance at dinner like a show worth remembering. Sophie sent me a quick message afterward, telling me that everyone agreed Daniel was too serious and needed to loosen up, and I let that thought settle into me like fuel. I decided then that if he was going to make me feel guilty for enjoying attention, I would prove I could handle myself without answering to him. When we got home, Daniel tucked Lily into bed while I packed a small bag, telling him I needed space to clear my head, and he only nodded without protest. I took his quietness as weakness, though now I know it was something else entirely. I headed out, not to a friend's house like I suggested, but to the Copperfinch Cafe, where Adrian often worked late evenings. He greeted me warmly, sliding a coffee across the counter without asking, and I felt a rush of power knowing I had slipped away from Daniel so easily. Sitting there with Adrian, I told myself it was harmless, just a friendly escape, but deep down I knew it was the start of something I would not be able to contain. I loved the thrill of pretending everything was innocent, while secretly building a story that made me feel alive again. When I returned home hours later, Daniel was still awake in the living room, and he asked quietly where I had been. I told him I had been with Sophie, that he should trust me more, and I spun the story so smoothly that even I almost believed it. He only nodded, writing something in the small notebook he kept by the couch, and I brushed it off as another of his pointless lists. At that moment, I thought I had won again, not realizing that every word I twisted and every secret I clung to was becoming another piece of evidence he would one day use to corner me completely. The lounge and the office became my stage, two places where I could perform the role of the charming woman who was constantly misunderstood by her serious husband. At Allied Insurance, Adrian leaned over my desk often, making jokes and asking about my day, and I felt a spark each time because it reminded me that I was still noticed. Daniel asked one evening why I had been staying late so often, and I told him that work was busy and that he should stop acting like a warden, twisting his concern into proof that he was controlling. The next morning in the break room, I told my colleagues that Daniel timed me every time I left the house, and they nodded in sympathy, saying they could never live with someone so insecure. I enjoyed their pity because it made me look like the victim while Daniel became the villain, even though in truth he had only asked if I was tired from long hours. After work, Adrian suggested grabbing a quick coffee at the Copperfinch Cafe, and I agreed instantly, enjoying the way he leaned across the table and told me I was too lively to be tied down by routines. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just friendly chatter, but I knew deep inside that I liked the excitement far more than I should. When Daniel noticed the cafe receipt in my bag, he asked gently if I had been out, and I laughed, telling him he was imagining things again, making him feel foolish for doubting me. At Sophie's apartment later that week, I repeated the story, saying Daniel interrogated me about every lunch break, and she shook her head, saying he was a jealous man who did not deserve someone as outgoing as me. I took her words as validation, repeating them to myself as if they were a shield, and I leaned harder into the idea that I was right to keep little secrets. At the office, Adrian slipped me a note with a small sketch and a playful line, which I tucked into my purse with a thrill, only to realize later that Daniel had seen me hide something. He did not say a word, but that quiet look of his unsettled me, though I told myself it meant nothing. That night at home, he asked if I enjoyed staying late with coworkers, and I snapped that he was obsessed with Adrian, accusing him of inventing drama that did not exist. I then told Ruth, my mother, that Daniel was so suspicious he questioned me about every interaction, and she sighed, saying all husbands worry, which I took as support, even though she sounded uneasy. Adrian began inviting me out more often, suggesting quick dinners after work, and I found excuses easily because Daniel never stopped me, never shouted, never demanded, only listened quietly. I mistook his silence for surrender, telling myself I was free, and I bragged to coworkers that my husband had finally given up trying to cage me. At the same time, Lily began asking small questions, like why Mommy worked so late and why Daddy looked sad, and I told her not to worry, claiming Daddy just had bad moods. I ignored how she fidgeted more at school, choosing instead to blame Daniel's seriousness whenever anyone noticed. Margaret saw through me quickly, telling Daniel to watch carefully, but I convinced myself she was only meddling because she never liked me from the start. I began staying out longer, meeting Adrian at the cafe after shifts, letting him walk me to my car, and once even slipping my hand through his arm just for the rush of it. I returned home smelling of coffee and perfume, and Daniel asked if I had fun, but I dismissed him with a smile, saying he should trust me for once. He wrote something down in his notebook again, and I told Sophie that he was keeping score like a prison guard, exaggerating until she laughed and said I was right to rebel. Each time I spun the story, I believed it more, and each time Daniel stayed silent, I thought I had finally won. What I never realized was that every receipt, every late-night return, and every playful message I dismissed was quietly building a case against me, one I would not see until it was already too late. The first time I truly crossed the line with Adrian, I convinced myself it was only a small indulgence, something private that would never touch the surface of my marriage, and I carried that lie like a prize. We met at a budget motel not far from the cafe, a place with flickering lights and worn carpet, the kind of spot where no one asked questions, and I walked in pretending it was harmless, even though my heart was pounding. Afterward, I told myself I could return home and act like nothing had changed, that Daniel would never notice, and that I could tuck the memory away as a secret victory. When I stepped through the front door later that night, Daniel asked gently where I had been, and I snapped that real men did not interrogate their wives, turning his calm concern into proof he was weak. That small exchange fueled me, because I believed that every defensive word made him look insecure while I looked confident, even though deep down I knew it was the opposite. Soon after, we hosted a backyard barbecue for neighbors and relatives, a cheerful gathering with paper plates and grilled food, and I used it as another stage to humiliate him. Standing near the drinks table, I announced loudly that Daniel still obsessed over my steps and my past, as if I could not walk down the street without him counting, and people laughed in front of him. I saw his face turn red as he turned to the grill, keeping his silence, and I felt a thrill, because I had once again placed him in the role of the ridiculous one. Lily tugged at his sleeve and whispered something, and I hated the way she looked confused. So later I told her Daddy was cranky because he lost a yard game, covering up the truth with an easier story. Margaret cornered me quietly and told me my public jabs were cruel, but I brushed her off with a sweet smile and told her people needed to lighten up, which only made her look rigid. Sophie recorded me on her phone, dancing with a drink in my hand, while Daniel stood in the background looking small, and she posted it online with a caption mocking jealous husbands, which gave me even more satisfaction. Henry watched in silence, his eyes colder than usual, but I ignored him because silence was easier to twist than confrontation. The next morning, Daniel met Henry for coffee, and when he returned, he looked calm, almost too calm, which unsettled me because I wanted him to appear broken. That night, he moved into the guest room, and I immediately told co-workers that he had abandoned me, framing myself as the wounded wife left alone in her own house. The truth was that he had begun noticing details I thought I had buried, like the folded motel receipt tucked into my tote, which he found without even searching, and instead of confronting me, he quietly wrote something in his notebook. His silence pressed against me, heavy and strange, but I convinced myself it was a sign that he had no fight left. I doubled down, meeting Adrian whenever I pleased, even though Adrian himself began pulling away, saying he did not want drama, and I laughed, insisting there was nothing to worry about. He stopped replying to my messages as quickly, and sometimes he left my texts unread, but I told myself he was just busy, not scared of exposure. Meanwhile, Dr. Alvarez mentioned during Lily's checkup that she seemed distracted and more clingy, and I quickly blamed Daniel's coldness, refusing to admit that she was picking up on our tension. Ruth repeated my words at family gatherings, saying Daniel's moods weighed down the house, and I smiled, letting her believe it, though she looked uncomfortable each time. Margaret stopped attending dinners, which I took as her silent protest, and Sophie only grew louder in her support, saying I was right to rebel against a boring husband. When Daniel suggested counseling or at least some boundaries, I rolled my eyes and told him boundaries were just another form of control, making him sound weak once again. That weekend, I told Sophie I was going to a girls' spa day, but instead I returned to the same motel where the night clerk gave me a knowing look that made me feel exposed. I brushed it off and told myself that even if someone noticed, Daniel would never act because he had proven over and over that his nature was quiet. What I never admitted was that his silence no longer felt like surrender, but like a wall building higher every day, one that I could not climb when the time finally came. By midsummer, I was convinced I had built an unshakable story, one where Daniel was the paranoid husband and I was the misunderstood wife, and I leaned harder into it each day. At the insurance office, I sat in the break room with co-workers and told them Daniel once threatened to follow me just to make sure I was not sneaking off with Adrian, which was entirely untrue, but sounded dramatic enough to earn their pity. They shook their heads and said he must be controlling, and I smiled as if relieved to be heard, even though I was only weaving another lie. At Sophie's rooftop party, I held a glass of wine and announced loudly that Daniel put me on a marriage curfew by asking for a shared calendar, and she repeated it gleefully to her friends, who nodded like I was trapped in some prison. In reality, Daniel had only asked to coordinate Lily's school drop-offs and my evening shifts, but I twisted it into something darker, because that version made me look like a free spirit fighting for air. At home, Daniel's silence grew deeper, and he began asking simple questions in the same steady tone, then writing notes in his small notebook instead of pressing me, which unsettled me more than anger would have. I ignored the unease and bragged to co-workers that I had finally broken him down, claiming he no longer dared challenge me. To prove myself, I started flaunting harmless messages from Adrian, showing Daniel a quick line about work and insisting it proved my honesty, while hiding the real receipts at the back of a closet box under folded scarves. I told Ruth that Daniel was starving me financially because he asked about household expenses, even though he had only suggested budgeting for Lily's sake, and she hugged me, repeating that men should trust their wives. Margaret stayed away from me entirely, though I knew she was speaking to Daniel, and Henry's eyes turned colder every time he saw me, though he kept his lips sealed. Adrian began stepping back further, replying less and sounding nervous whenever I hinted about meeting again, but I brushed it off and said he was simply too cautious. Sophie continued cheering me on, posting clips of me laughing with friends and captioning them with lines about freedom, giving me enough confidence to ignore the cracks widening around me. I convinced myself that friends online supported me, and that was stronger than Daniel's stillness, but his silence was not weakness, it was method. Then came the Sunday dinner at our townhouse. Both families gathered around the table with steaming dishes and small talk that barely covered the tension. I planned to keep the upper hand, making Daniel look dull and humorless once again, but halfway through the meal, the doorbell rang. Expecting a neighbor, I opened the door to find a man in a suit holding a thick envelope, with Margaret and Henry standing behind him. He confirmed my name and handed me the packet before walking away, leaving me frozen with everyone staring. I unfolded the papers and saw words like petition, custody, and financial orders, and my hands trembled as I realized what Daniel's silence had been building toward. When I looked back at the table, Daniel sat calmly with his plate untouched, and I understood that he had not surrendered at all. He had simply been preparing for the moment when I could no longer spin the story in my favor. Walking into Mr. Hale's office felt like stepping into a world where none of my tricks mattered, the air cool, and the walls lined with files that seemed to stare back at me, each one heavier than any story I could tell. Daniel sat across the desk beside the attorney, calm and collected, nodding as Mr. Hale explained temporary custody, financial separation, and restricted communication, and I felt like I was shrinking even before a word was said to me. I tried to laugh and said Daniel was ambushing me with paperwork because he could not win my heart, but neither man reacted, and the silence pressed harder than anger ever could. Back at the townhouse, our dining table turned into a battlefield of folders, calendars, and receipts, and I cried loudly, hoping Daniel would comfort me, but he only stacked the documents neatly while I raged. I called Sophie and told her Daniel wanted to take Lily away from me, and she fumed on my behalf, promising to tell everyone he was cruel, though she had no idea what evidence he already carried. I called Adrian and said Daniel was stalking me with notes and papers, but his voice went quiet, and after that he stopped replying to my messages entirely, leaving me abandoned in my own scheme. At work, I told colleagues Daniel had forged bank records to frame me as reckless. But Mr. Hale later presented the actual logs with dates and balances that even I could not twist. When Daniel froze the joint card, except for rent and groceries, I told my mother he was starving me. But then he created an expense sheet for Lily's needs that made him look practical and me selfish. I sobbed to Ruth, insisting he wanted to ruin me, but she quietly suggested I pause my late nights. And I felt betrayed because I expected her to defend me blindly. Margaret offered to handle weekly pickups, presenting it as kindness, though I saw it as a way to monitor me, and I snapped that she was interfering, while others praised her for stepping in. Henry handed Daniel a folder of Lily's school notes, showing her distraction and restlessness, and I accused him of ganging up against me, but deep down I saw the shift in everyone's eyes toward him. Dr. Alvarez gave us a handout on consistent routines, and Daniel agreed instantly, while I rolled my eyes and called routine another form of control, which even to me sounded hollow. Mr. Hale pulled everything into emotion. The motel receipts tied to my email, daycare reports of late pickups, bank records showing unusual charges, and even screenshots of my own posts where I bragged about keeping secrets. When the hearing was first scheduled, I thought I had weeks to find a way to spin it. But then the notice came that it was moved up to Friday, only 3 days away, and panic set in like a weight on my chest. At the park during a custody exchange, I tried to hand Lily my phone so she could say hello to Adrian, insisting it was innocent, but Daniel calmly pointed to the temporary order forbidding unrelated adults, and his quiet strength made me want to scream. I snapped that the judge would laugh at his stack of receipts, but inside, I felt walls closing in around me, because his silence had never been surrender. It had been strategy, and now the strategy was ready to corner me completely. The courtroom was colder than I imagined, with tall windows letting in pale light and the sound of papers shifting louder than anyone's voice, and I felt every eye watching me as I tried to look composed. Daniel spoke first with steady words, explaining Lily's bedtime, her school routine, and the way he prepared her meals, never once raising his tone or pointing a finger, which made him seem calm and reliable in front of the judge. When my turn came, I launched into a long story about how jealous he had always been, repeating that he checked my phone and accused me over Adrian, but the judge interrupted and asked me to stay focused on parenting instead of personal grudges. Mr. Hale stood and opened his binder, laying out exhibits in order, starting with the daycare reports about late pickups, then the bank logs showing unusual charges, then the motel receipts tied directly to my email and loyalty account, and each page made me shrink smaller. I tried to argue that the receipts were from a spa day with friends, but the evidence showed 2 separate check-ins under my name, and I knew even the gallery behind me did not believe my excuse. I insisted that Daniel's silence at home proved he was cold and unloving, but Mr. Hale replied that Daniel's quietness began when he started documenting events, which painted me as manipulative instead of honest. I claimed that my jokes were harmless, but the judge asked directly why Lily had been present at a barbecue where I mocked Daniel, and I had no answer that made me look like a caring mother. Margaret sat behind Daniel with folded hands. Henry kept quiet notes. Ruth dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and Sophie shifted in her chair like she was searching for a way to defend me but found none. The judge announced the temporary orders clearly. Custody split evenly with a strict calendar, all exchanges to be done at the park, and all communication limited to a co-parenting app, which meant my words no longer had power in daily life. The judge also ordered that finances be separated completely, with Daniel no longer responsible for my debts, and the joint card restricted only to agreed essentials with receipts uploaded monthly, which left me exposed. On top of that, there was a clause forbidding either of us from introducing new partners to Lily for 6 months, and another forbidding public or online disparagement, which turned all my jokes into liabilities I could no longer afford. The gavel struck softly, but it felt like thunder, because I understood in that moment that my stories had collapsed under the weight of receipts and notes, Daniel thanked the judge calmly and walked out of the courtroom with Mr. Hale beside him while I followed into the hallway trying to speak, but he simply pointed to the app on his phone and kept moving toward the elevator. Sophie touched my arm and whispered that we could still spin this, but even she looked doubtful now, scrolling her phone without posting anything, and I felt the hollow space where my power used to be. That evening, back at the townhouse, Lily stood in the doorway with her backpack and asked if tomorrow was Mommy Day or Daddy Day, and I stared at the new color-coded custody calendar, realizing the answer was no longer mine to give. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.